The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of shuffling papers and the low murmurs of attorneys preparing for their cases. Officer Gerald Hayes stood tall and rigid, his badge glinting under the harsh courtroom lights. His smug grin slowly faltered as the man in handcuffs, seated confidently at the defense table, adjusted his tie and looked him dead in the eye. The man was no ordinary defendant. He wasn't the petty thief or drug dealer Gerald had assumed he'd arrested the night before. No, this man's name was James Carter, and today, standing before the judge, he calmly slid a business card across the table to his attorney. Officer Hayes squinted at the card from across the room. The words, "Assistant U.S. Attorney," stared back at him in bold letters. Wait, what did he just say? Hayes stammered as his heart sank. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, are you confirming you're with the United States Attorney's Office?" James stood, his voice steady but piercing. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm a federal prosecutor, and I was wrongfully arrested last night by Officer Hayes." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Gerald's face turned pale, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room now focused on him. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain, but no words came out. He was caught, and he knew it. The judge tapped her gavel lightly, signaling order. "This is highly irregular. Officer Hayes, you'll need an explanation for this arrest immediately." But before Hayes could respond, James interrupted with a steely glare. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to recount exactly what happened." And just like that, the room hung on his every word. It had all started the night before. James Carter was on his way home from a late dinner with friends, dressed in a crisp suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He had just turned into his quiet suburban neighborhood when flashing red and blue lights lit up his rearview mirror. Sighing, James slowed his car and pulled over. He rolled down his window, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel as he waited for the officer to approach. Officer Hayes strutted up to the car, flashlight in hand, his tone already dripping with condescension. "License and registration," he barked without so much as a greeting. James complied, handing over his documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. Hayes barely glanced at the documents before tossing them onto the passenger seat. "Step out of the car," he ordered. James frowned. "May I ask why? I don't believe I've broken any laws." "Don't play smart with me," Hayes snapped. "Get out of the car now, or I'll make you get out." James hesitated for a moment, debating whether to push back or comply. He knew his rights, but he also knew how situations like this often ended. Slowly he stepped out of the car, raising his hands slightly to show he posed no threat. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Hayes ordered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Excuse me," James said, his calm demeanor cracking slightly. "What am I being arrested for?" "I don't have to explain myself to you," Hayes sneered. "You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for. Now turn around." James's jaw tightened. He could feel the familiar sting of anger bubbling up, but he forced himself to stay composed. He complied, allowing Hayes to snap the cuffs onto his wrists. As Hayes shoved him into the back of the squad car, James couldn't help but ask, "And what exactly is this suspect accused of doing?" "Armed robbery," Hayes replied without looking back. James raised an eyebrow. "In this suit, with a briefcase?" Hayes didn't respond, but James could see the officer's knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. The drive to the station was silent, the tension thick in the air. At the precinct, James was fingerprinted, photographed, and thrown into a holding cell without another word. He spent the night sitting on a cold metal bench, the injustice of the situation gnawing at him. But he refused to let despair take hold. He knew the truth would come out. By morning, James was escorted to court, still in handcuffs. The irony wasn't lost on him, as he walked past colleagues and acquaintances who undoubtedly recognized him. Whispers followed him down the hallway, but he kept his head high. And now, here he was, standing in front of a judge, recounting the events that had led to his wrongful arrest. His voice was steady, but the weight of his words was undeniable. "I told Officer Hayes multiple times that I was not the man he was looking for," James said, his eyes never leaving the officer. "I even offered to show him my identification and explain who I was, but he refused to listen. He made assumptions based solely on the color of my skin." The courtroom was silent, the tension almost unbearable. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his face now red with shame and anger. But James wasn't done. He turned to the judge, his voice firm. "Your Honor, this isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like Hayes to abuse their power and target innocent people based on nothing more than prejudice. And I will not let this go unanswered." The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, this court takes these allegations very seriously. Officer Hayes, you will have an opportunity to explain your actions, but for now, I suggest you prepare yourself." As James sat back down, the courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers. The air was electric, the promise of justice hanging in the balance. And just when it seemed the tension couldn't get any higher, the courtroom doors burst open. A young officer rushed in, clutching a file in his hands. "Your Honor," he called out breathlessly, "we just got the actual suspect in custody, and he doesn't look anything like Mr. Carter." Gasps filled the room, and all eyes turned back to Hayes. The officer's face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find an excuse. James leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but triumphant. The tide was turning, and this was only the beginning. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Officer Hayes shifted uneasily, the weight of dozens of judgmental stares pressing down on him. The judge's gavel struck sharply, bringing everyone's attention back to the bench. "Officer," the judge said sternly, addressing the young officer who had burst in with the new information, "step forward and clarify what you just said." The young officer hesitated, glancing at Hayes before walking to the center of the courtroom. He cleared his throat nervously and held up the file. "Your Honor, the real suspect in the armed robbery was apprehended early this morning. He was brought in after a tip from a local resident. He matches the victim's description exactly, and he's already confessed to the crime." The room erupted in murmurs, people craning their necks to catch a glimpse of Hayes. The judge's gavel struck again. "Quiet," she ordered before turning her sharp gaze to Hayes. "Officer Hayes, is this true?" Hayes swallowed hard, his mouth dry. I didn't know, Your Honor. At the time of the arrest, Mr. Carter fit the—" "Enough," the judge interrupted, her tone like ice. "Save your excuses for later. Right now, I need to speak with Mr. Carter privately. Bailiff, take Mr. Carter to my chambers. And, Officer Hayes," she added with a cold glare, "I suggest you remain here. We're far from Donny." "Hey!" As the bailiff motioned for James to follow, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. James stood, his movements calm and deliberate, though inside his emotions churned like a storm. The walk to the judge's chambers felt long, each step echoing in his mind. Once inside, the judge motioned for James to take a seat. She sat across from him, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I want to first apologize on behalf of this court. What happened to you is unacceptable." James nodded but remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "I know this is a delicate situation," the judge said, leaning forward. "You're a federal prosecutor, which makes this all the more shocking. But before we proceed, I need to ask, how would you like to handle this?" James took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. Your Honor, I appreciate your apology, but this isn't just about me. This is about systemic failure. If I were any other black man, without my credentials and position, I might still be in that holding cell or worse. Officer Hayes didn't see me. He only saw the color of my skin. The judge nodded slowly. I understand. If you'd like to press charges against Officer Hayes, the court will support you. I'll consider that, James said, his voice steady. But more importantly, I want this to lead to real accountability. Hayes isn't the first officer to act like this, and he won't be the last unless something changes. The judge regarded him thoughtfully. I admire your resolve, Mr. Carter, but be prepared. This won't be easy. You'll face pushback from the department, from their union, maybe even from people you thought were allies. James smiled faintly, though his eyes remained serious. Your Honor, I've been fighting battles my whole life. I'm not afraid of a little pushback. The judge gave a small nod of approval. Very well. Let's return to the courtroom and ensure the truth is fully revealed. After that, we'll discuss next steps. As James followed the bailiff back to the courtroom, he could feel a renewed sense of purpose burning inside him. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about justice. When they re-entered the room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Hayes stood rigidly at the front, his face a mixture of anger and embarrassment. The young officer who had exposed the truth stood nearby, avoiding Hayes' glare. The judge took her seat, tapping her gavel to silence the murmurs. We will resume. Mr. Carter, please return to your seat. James did as instructed, feeling the weight of the room's eyes on him. Officer Hayes, the judge began, her tone firm. It appears you made a grievous error in arresting Mr. Carter. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Hayes cleared his throat, his voice shaky. Your Honor, I believed I was acting in good faith. The suspect's description matched. Stop, the judge said, holding up a hand. Let me be clear. Your so-called good faith is no excuse for racial profiling or for failing to verify the facts. You arrested an innocent man based on assumptions that could have cost him his career or worse. Hayes' jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Effective immediately, the judge continued. I am recommending that Officer Hayes be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Additionally, Mr. Carter will have the option to press charges or file a formal complaint. The room erupted again, but this time the judge didn't silence them. She turned to James, her expression softening slightly. Mr. Carter, would you like to address the court? James stood, his shoulders square and his voice clear. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll keep this brief. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem, one that affects countless people who don't have the privilege of a law degree or a government title. This isn't just about me. It's about holding people accountable and ensuring that no one else has to go through what I die. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that happens. As James sat down, the courtroom erupted into applause, a rare and unorthodox moment in such a serious setting. The judge allowed it for a few seconds before tapping her gavel again. Thank you, Mr. Carter, she said, her tone solemn. This court will take the necessary steps to ensure justice is served. But just as things seemed to settle, a loud voice interrupted from the back of the room. This is a witch hunt. All heads turned to see a man in plain clothes storming into the courtroom. His face was flushed with anger, and he pointed a finger at James. This whole thing is a setup to ruin good cops like Hayes. The bailiff stepped forward, ready to intervene, but the man continued shouting. People like you are the real problem, always crying racism when the cops are just doing their jobs. James's heart pounded, but he forced himself to remain calm. The judge's gavel struck sharply. Sir, you are out of order. Bailiff, remove him from this courtroom immediately. As the man was dragged out, shouting obscenities all the way, James felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about Hayes anymore. It was about an entire system and the people who would do anything to protect it. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence after the outburst. The man's shouts still echoed faintly in James's ears as the bailiff closed the doors behind him. Though the immediate chaos was gone, the tension lingered like a storm cloud. James's mind raced. Who was that man? Was he just an angry citizen, or someone with deeper ties to Hayes or the police department? The judge rubbed her temples before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, let me make one thing clear. I will not tolerate disruptions in this court. Bailiff, ensure that man is detained and questioned about his motives for interrupting these proceedings. Now, let us proceed. James straightened his tie, willing himself to focus. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far bigger. Hours later, James sat at his desk in his office at the U.S. Attorney's office. The events of the day swirled in his mind as he typed out his official statement about the arrest. His colleagues had been supportive, some even outraged on his behalf, but James knew that support wouldn't be enough. Hayes wasn't just a rogue cop. He was a symptom of a much larger issue. James paused, staring at his screen. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID. It was Sheila, his wife. "Hey," he answered, leaning back in his chair. "Hey, James." Sheila's voice was warm, but tinged with concern. "How are you holding up?" James sighed. "I'm fine, just trying to process everything. It's been a day." "I saw the news," Sheila said softly. "They're already spinning it, calling it a misunderstanding. Some channels are even painting Hayes as the victim." James's jaw tightened. "Of course they are. That's what they do, deflect and distract. But I'm not letting this go, Sheila. Hayes targeted me because of the color of my skin, and people need to know that." "I know you won't let it go," Sheila said, her voice steady. "Just be careful, okay? When you push back against people like this, they push back harder, and not always in ways you expect." James closed his eyes, her words sinking in. He had already felt the weight of the system pressing against him. But Sheila was right. This was only the beginning. "You'll be careful," he promised. "But I won't back down." Later that evening, James sat in his living room, reviewing the case files he had requested on Officer Hayes. As he dug deeper, he uncovered a troubling pattern. Over the past 5 years, Hayes had been the subject of multiple complaints from Black and Latino residents. Claims of racial profiling, excessive force, and harassment. Yet none of the complaints had resulted in disciplinary action. James leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "This guy's got a history," he muttered to himself. Just then, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from his colleague Marcus, who worked in the Civil Rights Division. "Got something you'll want to see. Meet me at the office ASAP." James grabbed his coat and headed out the door. The U.S. Attorney's office was eerily quiet when James arrived. Marcus was waiting for him in a conference room, a laptop open in front of him. "What's so urgent?" James asked, closing the door behind him. Marcus gestured to the screen. "I pulled some internal records on Hayes. Turns out he's got connections, big ones. His uncle is a high-ranking official in the police union, and his brother works for a prominent law firm that specializes in defending officers accused of misconduct." James' stomach tightened. "So he's protected?" "Very," Marcus confirmed. "But that's not all. I dug deeper into the complaints against him. Most of them were dismissed because the victims either dropped their cases or disappeared altogether. And I mean literally disappeared. They moved, vanished, or stopped responding to inquiries." James's pulse quickened. "You think they were intimidated?" Marcus shrugged. "I can't prove it, but it wouldn't be the first time. And it's not just Hayes. There's a pattern with several officers in his precinct. Complaints disappear, victims go silent, and the cases get swept under the rug. James stared at the screen, anger and determination building in his chest. This isn't just about Hayes anymore. This is about the entire precinct. They're protecting their own at the expense of justice, Marcus nodded. Exactly. And if you're serious about going after Hayes, you'll need to be prepared for the fight of your life. They're not going to let this go without a fight. James' jaw tightened. Let them fight. I'm ready. The next morning, James filed an official complaint against Officer Hayes, requesting a full investigation into his arrest and the officer's history. The move made headlines, sparking a media firestorm. Some praised James for standing up to systemic racism, while others accused him of trying to ruin a good cop's career. The backlash was immediate. Anonymous threats began flooding his office voicemail. Reporters camped outside his house, shouting questions whenever he stepped outside. Sheila grew increasingly anxious, but James remained steadfast. One evening, as James was driving home from the office, he noticed a black SUV following him. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence. But when the SUV took every turn he did, even down quiet residential streets, his instincts kicked in. He pulled into a well-lit gas station and parked, watching in his rearview mirror as the SUV idled nearby. James's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. He pulled out his phone and called Sheila. James, she answered, her voice concerned. Sheila, listen to me, he said, his voice low. I think someone's following me. What? Where are you? Are you safe? I'm at a gas station, he said. You'll be home soon. Just lock the doors and keep the lights on. James, maybe you should call the police, Sheila suggested. James let out a bitter laugh. The police? They're probably the ones behind this. Sheila didn't argue, but her silence spoke volumes. James hung up and took a deep breath. The SUV was still there, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. Gathering his courage, James pulled out of the gas station and continued toward home, taking a deliberately winding route to see if the vehicle would follow. It did. James finally pulled into his driveway, his pulse pounding. The SUV stopped briefly at the end of the street before speeding off. James stood in his driveway, watching the Tylee gates disappear into the night. He knew now, without a doubt, that he was being watched. As he stepped inside, Sheila ran to him, relief and fear etched on her face. Are you okay? She asked, hugging him tightly. I'm fine, James said, though his voice was heavy. But this just got personal. Sheila pulled back, her eyes searching his. James, maybe it's time to step back. Think about us, about the kids. James cupped her face gently. I am thinking about you, about them. That's why I have to keep going. If I back down now, they'll win. And they'll keep doing this to people who don't have the resources or the voice to fight back. Sheila nodded reluctantly, though tears glistened in her eyes. Just promise me you'll be careful. I promise, James said, though he wasn't entirely sure he could keep it. As they locked up for the night, James couldn't shake the feeling that the SUV wouldn't be the last warning he received. The fight was only just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. The shadows seemed darker, and every creak of the house made James' pulse quicken. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Sheila's quiet breathing beside him, the only sound in the room. His mind raced, replaying the events of the day and the black SUV that had stalked him. He had known taking on Hayes and his precinct would be dangerous, but he hadn't anticipated the threats would start this soon, or be this bold. At some point, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. But it wasn't long before he was jolted awake by the piercing sound of a car alarm. James shot up, his heart pounding. Sheila stirred, confused. What's that? She mumbled, rubbing her eyes. James grabbed his phone from the nightstand and peered through the window. The source of the noise was his car, parked in the driveway. Its headlights flashed wildly, the alarm blaring into the quiet neighborhood. "Stay here," James said, pulling on a hoodie. "James, don't go out there," Sheila protested, gripping his arm. "He'll be fine," he assured her, though he wasn't entirely sure. He made his way downstairs, grabbing a baseball bat from the hall closet before stepping outside. The cold night air bit at his skin as he approached his car cautiously. His eyes darted to the bushes and trees, scanning for movement. The car's alarm stopped abruptly, plunging the street into eerie silence. James froze, gripping the bat tightly. Then he saw Ida, note stuck under the windshield wiper. His stomach churned as he reached for it, his hands trembling. The note was scrawled in thick, messy handwriting. "Back off, or you'll regret it." James' grip tightened on the paper, his jaw clenching. He scanned the street again, but whoever had left the note was long gone. He hurried back inside, locking the door behind him. Sheila was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale. "What was it?" she asked, her voice shaking. James handed her the note. She read it, her eyes widening in fear. "James, this is serious. We need to call someone." "Call who?" James snapped, though his anger wasn't directed at her. "The police. They're the ones trying to intimidate me." Sheila bit her lip, tears welling up. "I don't care who you call, but you can face this alone." James took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. She was right. He couldn't do this alone. The next morning, James met with Marcus and another colleague, Rachel, who specialized in civil rights cases. He showed them the note, his expression grim. "This isn't just about Hayes anymore," James said. "Someone wants to scare me off, and they're not being subtle about it." Rachel examined the note, her brow furrowed. "This isn't surprising. When you go after entrenched systems like this, they fight back. But this kind of threat is dangerous. Have you considered going public?" James shook his head. "Not yet. If I go public now, it could escalate things even further. I need more evidence, something concrete that shows this isn't just about me, but a pattern of corruption." Marcus nodded. "Then we need to dig deeper. If Hayes and his precinct are protecting each other, there's bound to be a trail. Complaints, payouts, maybe even internal communications. But getting access to that kind of information won't be easy." James leaned forward, determination in his eyes. "I don't care how hard it is. Whatever it takes, we're exposing the truth." Over the next few days, James threw himself into the investigation. He worked late into the night, combing through public records and court filings related to Hayes and his precinct. Marcus and Rachel worked alongside him, using every resource at their disposal to uncover the truth. The deeper they dug, the uglier the picture became. There were dozens of complaints against officers in the precinct, many of them eerily similar to James's experience, arrests made with little to no evidence, often targeting minorities. In most cases, the charges were dropped quietly, and the complaints went nowhere. But there was one case that stood out. A man named Darnell Porter had filed a lawsuit against the precinct 2 years earlier, claiming he had been wrongfully arrested and beaten by officers, including Hayes. The case had been settled out of court, and Darnell had disappeared shortly after. "This is it," James said, tapping the file. "If we can find Darnell, he could be the key to blowing this wide open." Rachel frowned. "If he's still around, people like Darnell don't just disappear for no reason. Either he was intimidated into silence or—" She trailed off, the unspoken possibility hanging in the air. James' stomach turned. He refused to believe Darnell was dead, but the thought lingered in the back of his mind. That evening, as James left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The streets felt too quiet, the shadows too deep. He quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. When he reached his car, he froze. The driver's side window had been smashed, glass littering the ground. On the seat was another note, weighted down by a rock. Last warning. James' hands trembled as he stared at the note. He felt a mix of fear and fury rising in his chest. They were escalating, and it was clear they wouldn't stop until he backed down. But backing down wasn't an option. James pulled out his phone and called Marcus. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Something just happened. By the time James arrived at Marcus' house, his resolve was stronger than ever. He showed Marcus the note, and his friend's expression darkened. "This is getting out of hand," Marcus said. "You need protection. If they're willing to vandalize your car, who knows what they'll do next?" "I'm not afraid of them," James said firmly. "But you're right. I need to be smart about this. We need to move fast to find Darnell and build a case before they can silence us." Marcus nodded, his jaw set. "I'll reach out to some contacts, see if I can track him down. In the meantime, you should lay low for a while. Let things cool off." James shook his head. "I can't afford to lay low, Marcus. If I stop now, they'll win." "Then be careful," Marcus said, gripping his shoulder. "We're in this together, but don't let your pride get you killed." James nodded, though he knew there was no turning back now. As James drove home that night, his mind raced with possibilities. Who was behind the threats? Was it just Hayes and his precinct, or were there others involved higher up, pulling the strings? He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the car speeding toward him until it was too late. The headlights appeared out of nowhere, blinding him as the car swerved into his lane. James yanked the wheel, narrowly avoiding a collision as the other car sped past him. His heart pounded as he pulled over to the side of the road, breathing heavily. For a moment he sat there in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The incident felt too deliberate to be an accident. James stared into the darkness, his fear replaced by a cold, burning determination. They wanted him scared. They wanted him to back down. But all they had done was strengthen his resolve. James parked his car in his driveway, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. The near collision wasn't just a warning, it was a message, loud and clear. Whoever was behind this wasn't playing games. Sheila opened the front door as soon as he stepped out of the car. Her face was pale, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. James hesitated, debating how much to tell her. "There was an incident," he said finally, trying to sound calm. "Someone tried to run me off the road." Sheila's hand flew to her mouth. "James, you need to stop this. It's too dangerous." James stepped closer, putting his hands on her shoulders. "Sheila, listen to me. If I stop, they win. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone they've hurt. Everyone they'll keep hurting if no one stands up to them." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't argue. "I just don't want to lose you," she whispered. "You won't," James said, pulling her into a hug. "I promise." The next morning, James met with Marcus and Rachel at the office. The atmosphere was tense as James recounted the events of the previous night. "That was no coincidence," Marcus said, pacing the room. "They're trying to scare you off. And they're getting bolder." Rachel tapped her pen against the table, deep in thought. "We need to escalate this. If we wait too long, they'll only tighten their grip. Did you manage to find anything more on Darnell Porter?" Marcus shook his head. "I reached out to some old contacts, but no one seems to know where he is. It's like he vanished off the face of the earth." James frowned. "Then we need to dig deeper. Someone knows what happened to him. We just have to find the right person to talk." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "What about his lawyer? The one who handled the settlement?" They might have information. James nodded. That's a good lead. He'll track them down. Marcus hesitated. James, are you sure you should be the one to follow this? After what happened last night, it might be safer to let someone else take the lead. James met his friend's gaze, his expression steely. This is my fight, Marcus. I'm not handing it off to anyone else. Tracking down Darnell's lawyer proved easier than expected. Her name was Veronica Fields, and she worked for a mid-sized civil rights firm downtown. When James called her office, she agreed to meet him that afternoon. James arrived at her office building, a modest but well-kept structure tucked between two skyscrapers. Veronica was waiting for him in a small conference room, her demeanor calm, but guarded. "Mr. Hunter," she said, extending a hand. "I've heard about your situation. I'm sorry for what you've been through." "Thank you," James said, taking a seat. "I appreciate you meeting with me. I need to ask you about Darnell Porter." Veronica's expression tightened. "Darnell, that's a name I haven't heard in a while. What's this about?" "I believe he's a key piece in exposing corruption in Hayes Precinct," James explained. "But I can't find him. I was hoping you might know where he is, or at least what happened to him." Veronica sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Darnell was one of the bravest clients I ever had. He stood up to that precinct when no one else would. But after the settlement, he disappeared. He told me he was leaving town to protect himself, but he didn't say where he was going." "Did he ever contact you after that?" James asked. Veronica shook her head. "No, I tried to reach out a few times, but his phone was disconnected. I assumed he wanted to put everything behind him." James frowned, disappointment settling in his chest. "If he's off the grid, it's going to be hard to find him." Veronica hesitated, then leaned forward. "There's one thing that might help. Before he left, Darnell mentioned he had a cousin who worked at a diner on the east side. I don't know her name, but he said she was the only family he still trusted. She might know where he is." James's eyes lit up. "That's a start. Thank you." Veronica's gaze softened. "Be careful, Mr. Hunter. The people you're going after, they don't play fair." "I know," James said. "But I'm not backing down." The diner was a small, unassuming place tucked into a corner of a busy intersection. James entered, the scent of coffee and grilled food filling the air. He approached the counter, where a young woman in her 20s was taking orders. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm looking for someone who might work here. Her cousin's name is Darnell Porter." The woman's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her reaction. "Why are you asking?" James pulled out his badge. "I'm a federal prosecutor. I'm investigating corruption in the precinct that arrested him. I just want to help." She studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the back. "That's Trina. She's on her break." James turned to see a woman in her late 30s sitting at a corner booth, scrolling through her phone. He approached her cautiously. "Trina." She looked up, her expression wary. "Who's asking?" "My name's James Hunter," he said, showing his badge. "I'm trying to find your cousin, Darnell. I think he might have information that could help me expose corruption in the police department." Trina's eyes narrowed. "Darnell's been through enough. Why should I trust you?" "Because I've been through it too," James said, his voice earnest. "The same officer who arrested him targeted me. But I'm in a position to fight back, and I want to make sure no one else has to go through what we did. Trina studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Darnell doesn't trust anyone anymore. But I can tell you this, he's staying at a motel out in Fairview. It's off the highway, near the old truck stop. Room 12. James nodded. "Thank you. I promise we'll handle this carefully." Trina's expression softened, but her voice was firm. "You'd better. Because if anything happens to him, he'll hold you responsible." That evening, James drove out to the motel in Fairview. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the rundown building. He parked and approached room 12, his heart pounding. He knocked lightly on the door. "Darnell, my name is James Hunter. I'm a federal prosecutor. I need to talk to you." For a moment there was silence. Then the door opened a crack, revealing a man in his 40s, with wary eyes. "What do you want?" Darnell asked, his voice low. "I want to expose the officers who did this to you," James said. "But I need your help." Darnell stared at him for a long moment, then opened the door wider. "Come in." James stepped inside, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the lead he had been searching for. But as the door closed behind him, James couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, and the fight ahead would only get more dangerous. The air in the motel room was thick with tension. Darnell Porter stood by the window, his arms crossed, while James sat on the edge of the bed. The room was dimly lit, and the muffled hum of passing trucks outside made the space feel isolated. "You've got guts coming here," Darnell said finally, his voice filled with both suspicion and exhaustion. "I've seen what they do to people who stand up to them." James leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I know what they're capable of, Darnell. I've lived it. But we can't let them keep getting away with this. You stood up to them once. You can help me bring them down for our good." Darnell let out a bitter laugh. "And what did that get me? Beaten, humiliated, and forced to run for my life. I lost everything, my job, my home, my peace of mind." He turned to face James, his eyes narrowing. "Why should I believe it'll be any different this time?" "Because I won't let them silence us," James said firmly. "I'm a federal prosecutor. I have resources, allies, and the law on my side. But I need you, Darnell. Your story could be the key to exposing their corruption." Darnell hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know, man. I've been hiding for a reason. If they find out I'm talking to you, they'll come after me again." "They already know I'm coming after them," James said. "They vandalized my car, sent me threats, even tried to run me off the road. But I'm still here, and I won't stop until justice is served." Darnell's eyes flicked back to James, studying him intently. For the first time, there was a glimmer of something other than fear in his expression. Hope. "What do you need me to do?" Darnell asked quietly. James smiled, relief washing over him. "Just tell me your story. Every detail you remember about what happened to you, from the moment they arrested you to the settlement. Anything that could help us prove a pattern of misconduct." Darnell nodded slowly and sat down across from James. He took a deep breath before beginning. "It was 2 years ago," Darnell started, his voice steady, but tinged with anger. "I was walking home from my shift at the warehouse. It was late, and I cut through the park like I always did. That's when I saw them, Hayes and 2 other officers. They were harassing this young black kid, maybe 15 or 16. The kid looked terrified. James leaned in, listening intently. "I couldn't just walk away," Darnell continued. "I told them to leave the kid alone, that he wasn't doing anything wrong. Hayes turned to me, and I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't going to let me walk away after that. He told me to mind my business, and when I didn't, they decided I was the problem." Darnell's hands clenched into fists as he spoke. "They threw me against a wall, accused me of resisting arrest. I kept telling them I didn't do anything, but they didn't care. Hayes punched me in the gut, and one of the others hit me in the face. By the time they dragged me to the station, I was bleeding and barely able to stand." James felt a surge of anger, but he kept his composure. "Did they charge you with anything?" "They tried," Darnell said. "They claimed I assaulted an officer, but the charges didn't stick. My lawyer pointed out the lack of evidence, and the case was dismissed. But they weren't done with me. A few weeks later, I got jumped by 2 guys who said they were friends of Hayes. That's when I knew I had to get out of town. And the settlement? James asked. Darnell hesitated, his expression darkening. That was their way of shutting me up. My lawyer convinced me to take it, said it was better than risking my life. But looking back, I wish he'd fought harder. James nodded, his mind racing. Darnell's story was damning, but he needed more than just testimony. He needed evidence, something concrete that could tie Hayes and his precinct to a pattern of abuse and cover-ups. Darnell, James said carefully, do you have anything? Documents, photos, anything from your case that could help us? Darnell frowned, thinking. Maybe. When I left, I took a box of stuff from my apartment. Papers, court filings, that kind of thing. It's in a storage unit a few miles from here. That could be exactly what we need, James said. Can you take me there? Darnell hesitated, glancing toward the window. It's risky. If they're watching you, they could be watching me too. Well, be careful, James assured him. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets. An hour later, James and Darnell arrived at the storage facility. The sun had set, and the dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows across the rows of units. Darnell led James to a unit near the back, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the door. Inside, the unit was cluttered with boxes and old furniture. Darnell rummaged through one of the boxes, pulling out a stack of papers. This is it, he said, handing them to James. Everything from the case. James flipped through the papers, his heart racing. There were police reports, witness statements, and even photos of Darnell's injuries. But what caught his attention most was a list of names people who had filed complaints against Hayes and his precinct. This is gold, James said, his voice filled with excitement. This could blow the case wide open. But before Darnell could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside made both men freeze. James peered out of the unit and saw two black SUVs pulling into the lot. His stomach dropped. They found us, Darnell whispered, panic rising in his voice. James grabbed the papers and stuffed them into his bag. We need to get out of here. Now, Darnell nodded, and the two men slipped out of the unit, keeping low. The SUVs had parked near the entrance, and several men in plain clothes were stepping out. James' mind raced as he assessed the situation. They couldn't go back to his care, it was too far, and they'd be spotted. This way, Darnell said, motioning toward a side gate. The two men moved quickly and quietly, staying in the shadows. James' heart pounded as they reached the gate and slipped through. But just as they thought they were in the clear, a voice shouted behind them, "Hey, stop!" James and Darnell broke into a sprint, their footsteps echoing in the night. The sound of pursuit grew louder, and James realized they were outnumbered. They needed a plan, and fast. James' legs burned as he and Darnell sprinted down the dark alleyway behind the storage facility. The shouts of their pursuers grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of heavy boots pounding the pavement. This way, Darnell hissed, veering sharply to the left and ducking behind a row of parked cars. James followed, his breath coming in short gasps. He could feel the weight of the papers in his bag pressing against his side, evidence that could finally bring Hayes and his cronies to justice. But none of it would matter if they didn't make it out alive. They crouched low, peering through the gaps between the cars. 4 men had fanned out across the lot, flashlights cutting through the darkness. One of them barked orders into a radio. "They're splitting up," James whispered. "We can't stay here." Darnell nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "There's an old drainage tunnel about a block from here. If we can get to it, we might lose them." James glanced at the men, then back at Darnell. "Lead the way." The two of them crept along the row of cars, staying as low and quiet as possible. James's heart pounded in his chest as one of the flashlights swept dangerously close to their hiding spot. Suddenly, one of the men shouted, "Over there!" James and Darnell bolted. The men gave chase, their footsteps thundering behind them. James's mind raced as they darted through the narrow alleyways, the dim streetlights offering little visibility. "There!" Darnell yelled, pointing to a metal grate embedded in the ground. He dropped to his knees and yanked it open, revealing a dark, foul-smelling tunnel. "Go," James urged, pulling Darnell inside before climbing in himself. The grate clanged shut just as the pursuers rounded the corner. "Where'd they go?" one of the men shouted. James and Darnell crouched in the darkness, holding their breath. Above them, flashlights scanned the area. "Keep low, Oking," another voice ordered. They couldn't have gotten far. The sound of footsteps began to fade as the men moved farther down the alley. James exhaled shakily, his muscles still tense. "Let's move," Darnell whispered, leading the way deeper into the tunnel. The tunnel was damp and cramped, the air thick with the stench of sewage. James had to stoop to avoid hitting his head on the low ceiling. "Are you sure this leads somewhere?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly. Darnell glanced back at him. "Yeah. It opens up near the river. We just have to keep moving." They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the dripping of water and their own footsteps. Finally, a faint glimmer of moonlight appeared ahead. "There it is," Darnell said, relief evident in his voice. They climbed out of the tunnel and found themselves on the banks of a wide, slow-moving river. The cool night air was a welcome change from the stifling tunnel. James leaned against a tree, catching his breath. "We can't stay here long. They'll figure out we went underground eventually." Darnell nodded. "I know a place we can lay low. It's not far." "Let's go," James said, adjusting the strap of his bag. Darnell led James to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was dilapidated, with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls, but it offered shelter and, most importantly, anonymity. Inside, they found an old wooden crate to sit on. James pulled the papers from his bag and spread them out on the dusty floor. "These names," he said, pointing to the list of complainants. "Do you recognize any of them?" Darnell scanned the list, his brow furrowing. "Yeah. A couple of them were at the station the same time I was. One of them, Tyrone Jenkins, she got it worse than me. They broke his arm and claimed he fell down the stairs." James jotted the name down. "Do you know where I can find him?" "Last I heard, he was staying with his sister on the south side," Darnell said. "But that was a while ago. He might be moved." "It's a start," James said. Darnell hesitated, then pointed to another name. "And this guy, Luis Ortiz. He used to work at a car shop near Main Street. He saw Hayes plant drugs in a guy's car once. They tried to get him to keep quiet, but he wouldn't. Next thing he knew, his shop mysteriously burned down." James's jaw tightened. The deeper this went, the more horrifying it became. "We're building a case," he said, more to himself than to Darnell. "But we need more. Testimonies, evidence, anything that ties Hayes to a pattern of abuse." Darnell nodded. "It'll help however I can. But you need to be careful. These guys don't just bend the law, they break it in half." "I know," James said, determination hardening his voice. "But they messed with the wrong man." The next morning, James and Darnell made their way back to the city under the cover of early dawn. They avoided main roads, taking back alleys and side streets to stay out of sight. James dropped Darnell off near a friend's apartment, promising to keep him updated. Then he headed straight to the office to meet with Marcus and Rachel. "You look like hell," Marcus said when James walked in, his clothes rumpled and his face drawn. "Long night," James replied, setting the papers on the table. but it was worth it. We've got to lead a big one. He quickly filled them in on what had happened, from the chase at the storage unit to the information Darnell had provided. Rachel's eyes widened as she flipped through the documents. This is incredible, James. If we can corroborate these stories, we might have enough to launch a full-scale investigation. Marcus frowned. What about the guys who chased you? Any idea who they were? Not yet, James admitted. But they were coordinated, and they weren't amateurs. Someone with serious pull sent them. Rachel nodded grimly. Which means we need to move fast. If they know you've got this, they'll do whatever it takes to shut you down. Let them try, James said. I'm not stopping until Hayes and everyone protecting him are held accountable. Marcus placed a hand on James's shoulder. We're with you, man. All the way. As the day wore on, James and his team began piecing together the puzzle. They reached out to the names on the list, hoping to gather more testimonies. By evening, they had managed to track down two people, Tyrone Jenkins and Luis Ortiz, who agreed to meet with them. The team was cautiously optimistic, but James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He left the office late that night, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. When he reached his car, he froze. The windshield had been smashed, and a single bullet was embedded in the driver's seat. A note was taped to the steering wheel. It read, "Stop now, or you won't live to regret it." James' blood ran cold as he stared at the ominous message. They were no longer just trying to scare him, they were ready to kill. James stood frozen by his car, staring at the bullet lodged in the seat and the chilling note taped to the steering wheel. The night air felt heavier now, as though it was pressing against his chest. He scanned the dark street around him, his instincts on high alert. The shadows of parked cars and flickering streetlights suddenly seemed more menacing. His first instinct was to call the police, but he stopped himself. The very system he was fighting against couldn't be trusted, not when Hayes and his crew had their tentacles deep within it. Instead, he took a deep breath, pulled his phone from his pocket, and dialed Marcus. James? Marcus' voice was groggy but instantly concerned. What's going on? They found me again, James said, his voice low and tense. Smashed my windshield, left a bullet in my seat, and a note. They're done sending warnings, Marcus. This is serious. Where are you? Marcus asked, the urgency in his voice cutting through the late-night haze. Outside the office, by my car. Don't stay there. Drive somewhere safe, anywhere. I'll meet you. Rachel and I are on our way. James glanced at his ruined windshield and the jagged hole in the seat. I'll take another car. I'm not driving this one anywhere. Good idea. Don't go home either. They might already know where you live. I know, James said, his voice grim. He'll call you once I'm settled somewhere. James ended the call and quickly grabbed the evidence bag from his car, stuffing the papers and files into his work briefcase. He couldn't risk leaving anything behind. He walked briskly to a nearby parking garage where he kept a second car, a precaution he'd taken years ago for reasons he hadn't fully appreciated until now. Sliding into the driver's seat of the old sedan, James turned the ignition and pulled out of the garage, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. He drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, winding through city streets and back roads, making sure he wasn't being followed. Eventually, he pulled into a small roadside motel just outside the city. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow on the gravel parking lot. James checked in under a fake name, using the alias he had created for emergencies. Inside the tiny room, he bolted the door, drew the curtains, and sat heavily on the bed. The adrenaline that had been keeping him sharp began to wear off, leaving behind an overwhelming exhaustion. He stared at the note again. Stop now, or you won't live to regret it. The words felt like a weight pressing down on him, but they also ignited a fire in his chest. Whoever had sent this message underestimated him. He wasn't going to stop. The next morning, James met Marcus and Rachel at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town. The location was chosen deliberately, far from their usual haunts and unlikely to draw attention. Marcus leaned forward in the booth, his brow furrowed. "Do you think it's Hayes or someone higher up?" James sipped his coffee, his hand trembling slightly. "It could be either. Hayes isn't smart enough to orchestrate something this calculated, but he's got powerful friends. Whoever it is, they want to scare me off before I get too close." Rachel spread out the papers on the table, her eyes scanning the list of names. "We've got 2 solid leads, Tyrone Jenkins and Luis Ortiz. We need to interview them as soon as possible." James nodded. "It'll take Luis. He's less likely to feel intimidated by a federal prosecutor showing up at his door. Marcus, can you handle Tyrone?" "Of course," Marcus said, "but we should be careful. If Hayes or his people are watching us, they'll notice if we make any sudden moves." Rachel tapped her pen on the table, deep in thought. "What about protection? Shouldn't we call in someone from the FB or even the marshals?" James hesitated. "I don't trust anyone in law enforcement right now. Until we know how deep this goes, we're on our own." Rachel sighed but didn't argue. She understood the risks all too well. That afternoon, James drove to the address Darnell had provided for Luis Ortiz. The neighborhood was rough, with boarded-up windows and overgrown yards, but it wasn't entirely abandoned. Children played basketball in the street, their laughter a sharp contrast to the tension James felt. He parked a block away and walked to the small auto shop where Luis now worked. The sign above the building was faded, and the garage door was half open, revealing a cluttered workbench and an old car lifted on a jack. Inside, Luis was leaning over the engine, wiping his hands with a rag. He looked up as James entered, his expression guarded. "You Ortiz?" James asked. "Who's asking?" Luis replied, his tone cautious. James pulled out his badge. "James Carter. I'm a federal prosecutor. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk." Luis stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, make it quick." James explained the investigation, carefully choosing his words to avoid spooking Luis. When he mentioned Hayes, Luis' expression darkened. "I know that name," Luis said. "Too well. He ruined my life." "How?" James asked, pulling out his notepad. Luis leaned against the workbench, his hands tightening into fists. "Couple years back, Hayes came into my old shop with some of his buddies. They claimed they needed a quick repair, but I could tell they were looking for something. I stayed out of their way until I saw Hayes plant a bag of drugs in a customer's car." James' pen froze mid-scribble. "What did you do?" "I confronted him," Luis said bitterly. "Told him I wasn't going to let him frame my customer. Hayes laughed in my face and said, 'Who's going to believe you over me?' And what happened after that?" Luis' eyes darkened. "A week later, my shop burned down. Everything I had, gone. The fire marshal said it was arson, but they never found out who did it. I know it was Hayes or someone he sent." James jotted down every detail, his mind racing. Luis' story matched the pattern of abuse and intimidation he'd seen in Darnell's case. "Would you be willing to testify?" James asked. Luis hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I've got a family to think about. If Hayes finds out I talked to you—" "I understand," James said gently. "But your testimony could help bring him down, for good. And he'll do everything in my power to protect you and your family." Luis looked at James, his expression conflicted. Finally, he nodded. "All right. I'll do it. But you'd better make sure this sticks." As James left the auto shop, he felt a surge of hope. With Luis' testimony and the evidence from Darnell, they were building a solid case, but his optimism was short-lived. As he reached his car, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Marcus. "James," Marcus said, his voice strained. "It's Tyrone." "Has gone." "What do you mean, gone?" James demanded. "Someone got to him before I did," Marcus said. "His sister said 2 men came to the house last night. Tyrone left with them, and he hasn't been seen since." James's stomach dropped. "They're silencing witnesses," Marcus continued. "We need to move fast, James, before we lose anyone else." James gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. The stakes had just been raised, again. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as Marcus' words echoed in his mind. "They're silencing witnesses." For a brief moment, he felt the crushing weight of the battle he was fighting. The stakes were rising by the hour, and the enemy was ruthless, willing to eliminate anyone who posed a threat. But that moment of doubt quickly turned into determination. Tyrone might be gone, but James wasn't going to let Hayes and his accomplices get away with it. "Do we have any leads on where they might have taken him?" James asked, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "Not yet," Marcus replied. His sister said the men claimed to be detectives, but she knew they weren't legit. She managed to catch part of their license plate before they drove off. "I'm running it now." "Good," James said. "Keep me updated." "I'm heading back to the office. We need to regroup." The drive back to the city felt like a blur, the pieces of the puzzle spinning in James's head. Tyrone's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. Hayes and his network were feeling the pressure, and they were striking back. By the time James reached the office, Marcus and Rachel were already there, waiting for him. Marcus had a laptop open, the screen displaying a grainy image of a license plate. Rachel looked up, her face pale with worry. "Any luck?" James asked, dropping his briefcase onto the table. Marcus shook his head. "The plate's partial, and it's not registered in the system. Either it's fake, or whoever owns it has enough. Pull to keep it off the radar." James swore under his breath. "What about Tyrone's sister? Did she see anything else?" Rachel nodded. "She mentioned one of the men had a tattoo on his forearm, some kind of skull with wings. It sounded like a gang symbol." James's eyes narrowed. Skull with wings. That could be the Iron Brotherhood. They're a biker gang Hayes has been tied to in the past. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You think Hayes is using them as muscle?" "It's possible," James said. "If he wanted someone taken out quietly, they'd be the perfect choice." Rachel frowned. "So what's the plan? We can't just sit here waiting for another witness to vanish." James rubbed his temples, thinking. "We need to put the pressure back on Hayes. If we can expose him publicly, he'll lose his ability to operate in the shadows. But we can't do that without more evidence." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Luis agreed to testify, right? He could be the key to blowing this wide open." "Maybe," James said. "But if they find out he's talking, he'll be next. We need to keep him safe." Rachel tapped her pen against the table. "What about Tyrone? If he's still alive, we need to find him. Fast." James nodded. "You'll reach out to some contacts in the FBI. Discreetly. They might have intel on the Iron Brotherhood's operations. In the meantime, Marcus, keep digging into that license plate. Rachel, see if you can find any other witnesses willing to come forward." The next few hours were a flurry of activity. James made several calls, speaking in hushed tones to trusted colleagues in the FBI. Most were hesitant to get involved without official clearance, but one agent, a woman named Angela Ward, agreed to help. "If the Iron Brotherhood's involved, I might have something for you," Angela said. "We've been monitoring their safe houses in the area. There's a warehouse they've been using on the west side. Might be worth checking out." "Send me the address," James said. "And Angela, keep this off the books." "You've got it," she replied. As night fell, James, Marcus, and Rachel piled into an unmarked car and headed for the warehouse. The drive was tense, each of them acutely aware of the risks. If Hayes or the Brotherhood caught wind of their plan, it could end badly. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a massive, dilapidated structure surrounded by chain-link fencing. Dim lights flickered inside, casting eerie shadows through the broken windows. James parked a block away, and the three of them approached on foot, keeping low to avoid being seen. "This place gives me the creeps," Marcus muttered. "Stay focused," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. They reached the fence and found a section where the links had been cut, leaving a gap just big enough to squeeze through. Inside the perimeter, the air was thick with the smell of oil and smoke. They crept toward the building, their footsteps silent on the gravel. When they reached the side door, James gestured for Marcus to cover him. He tested the handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior filled with crates and motorcycle parts. Voices echoed from deeper inside, but they couldn't make out the words. James motioned for Rachel and Marcus to follow as they slipped inside. They moved through the maze of crates, inching closer to the voices. As they rounded a corner, they froze. In the center of the room, Tyrone was tied to a chair, his face bloodied and swollen. Two men stood over him, one holding a knife, the other laughing cruelly. James' heart pounded as he assessed the situation. They couldn't just rush in. One wrong move, and Tyrone would be dead. He pulled out his phone and quickly texted Angela. "Tyrone found. Send backup to the warehouse now." As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, the man with the knife turned to Tyrone, his voice cold and menacing. "Last chance," he said. "Who did you talk to?" Tyrone spat blood onto the floor, defiance flashing in his swollen eyes. "Go to hell." The man raised the knife. James didn't think. He acted. "FBI, drop the weapon," he shouted, stepping into view with his gun drawn. The two men froze, their eyes darting between James and the shadows where Marcus and Rachel emerged, also armed. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Then, the man with the knife lunged. James fired, the shot echoing through the warehouse. The man dropped to the ground, clutching his leg and screaming in pain. The other man raised his hands, fear etched across his face. "Don't shoot," he pleaded. James moved quickly, kicking the knife away and securing the wounded man while Marcus restrained the other. Rachel rushed to Tyrone's side, untying him and checking his injuries. "You're safe now," she said softly. Tyrone looked up at her, his voice weak but steady. "You have no idea what you've just walked into." Before James could ask what he meant, the sound of engines roared outside. Rachel's eyes widened. "They're here." James's stomach dropped as the realization hit him. The Iron Brotherhood wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The rumble of engines grew louder, echoing off the warehouse walls. James's heart skipped a beat as he scanned the room, mentally preparing for the fight ahead. The Iron Brotherhood had arrived, and they weren't going to leave empty-handed. "Move now," James barked. He grabbed Tyrone by the arm, pulling him to his feet. "Get to the back exit, now!" Marcus and Rachel followed, keeping their weapons trained on the two men they'd restrained. The sound of motorcycles revving outside confirmed their worst fear. Hayes goons were closing in fast. They rushed toward the rear of the warehouse, their footsteps heavy and hurried against the floor. But before they could reach the door, the overhead lights flickered out, plunging them into darkness. James swore under his breath. "What about Tyrone's sister? Did she see anything else?" Rachel nodded. She mentioned one of the men had a tattoo on his forearm, some kind of skull with wings. It sounded like a gang symbol. James's eyes narrowed. Skull with wings. That could be the Iron Brotherhood. They're a biker gang Hayes has been tied to in the past. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You think Hayes is using them as muscle? It's possible, James said. If he wanted someone taken out quietly, they'd be the perfect choice. Rachel frowned. So what's the plan? We can't just sit here waiting for another witness to vanish. James rubbed his temples, thinking. We need to put the pressure back on Hayes. If we can expose him publicly, he'll lose his ability to operate in the shadows. But we can't do that without more evidence. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Luis agreed to testify, right? He could be the key to blowing this wide open. Maybe, James said. But if they find out he's talking, he'll be next. We need to keep him safe. Rachel tapped her pen against the table. What about Tyrone? If he's still alive, we need to find him. Fast. James nodded. I'll reach out to some contacts in the FBI. Discreetly. They might have intel on the Iron Brotherhood's operations. In the meantime, Marcus, keep digging into that license plate. Rachel, see if you can find any other witnesses willing to come forward. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. James made several calls, speaking in hushed tones to trusted colleagues in the FBI. Most were hesitant to get involved without official clearance, but one agent, a woman named Angela Ward, agreed to help. If the Iron Brotherhood's involved, I might have something for you, Angela said. We've been monitoring their safe houses in the area. There's a warehouse they've been using on the west side. Might be worth checking out. Send me the address, James said. And Angela, keep this off the boo. 'Cause you've got it, she replied. As night fell, James, Marcus, and Rachel piled into an unmarked car and headed for the warehouse. The drive was tense, each of them acutely aware of the risks. If Hayes or the Brotherhood caught wind of their plan, it could end badly. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a massive, dilapidated structure surrounded by chain-link fencing. Dim lights flickered inside, casting eerie shadows through the broken windows. James parked a block away, and the three of them approached on foot, keeping low to avoid being seen. This place gives me the creeps, Marcus muttered. Stay focused, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. They reached the fence and found a section where the links had been cut, leaving a gap just big enough to squeeze through. Inside the perimeter, the air was thick with the smell of oil and smoke. They crept toward the building, their footsteps silent on the gravel. When they reached the side door, James gestured for Marcus to cover him. He tested the handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior filled with crates and motorcycle parts. Voices echoed from deeper inside, but they couldn't make out the words. James motioned for Rachel and Marcus to follow as they slipped inside. They moved through the maze of crates, inching closer to the voices. As they rounded a corner, they froze. In the center of the room, Tyrone was tied to a chair, his face bloodied and swollen. Two men stood over him, one holding a knife, the other laughing cruelly. James' heart pounded as he assessed the situation. They couldn't just rush in one wrong move, and Tyrone would be dead. He pulled out his phone and quickly texted Angela. Tyrone found. Send backup to the warehouse now. As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, the man with the knife turned to Tyrone, his voice cold and menacing. Last chancey. Hey, he said. Who did you talk to? Tyrone spat blood onto the floor, defiance flashing in his swollen eyes. Go to hell. The man raised the knife. James didn't think he acted. FBI. Drop the weapon, he shouted, stepping into view with his gun drawn. The two men froze, their eyes darting between James and the shadows where Marcus and Rachel emerged, also armed. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Then, the man with the knife lunged. James fired, the shot echoing through the warehouse. The man dropped to the ground, clutching his leg and screaming in pain. The other man raised his hands, fear etched across his face. "Don't shoot," he pleaded. James moved quickly, kicking the knife away and securing the wounded man, while Marcus restrained the other. Rachel rushed to Tyrone's side, untying him and checking his injuries. "You're safe now," she said softly. Tyrone looked up at her, his voice weak but steady. "You have no idea what you've just walked into." Before James could ask what he meant, the sound of engines roared outside. Rachel's eyes widened. "They're here." James' stomach dropped as the realization hit him. The Iron Brotherhood was going to let them leave without a fight. The rumble of engines grew louder, echoing off the warehouse walls. James's heart skipped a beat as he scanned the room, mentally preparing for the fight ahead. The Iron Brotherhood had arrived, and they weren't going to leave empty-handed. "Move now!" James barked. He grabbed Tyrone by the arm, pulling him to his feet. "Get to the back exit now!" Marcus and Rachel followed, keeping their weapons trained on the two men they'd restrained. The sound of motorcycles revving outside confirmed their worst fear. Hayes goons were closing in fast. They rushed toward the rear of the warehouse, their footsteps heavy and hurried against the floor. But before they could reach the door, the overhead lights flickered out, plunging them into darkness. James swore under his breath. "Stay calm," he instructed, his voice low but steady. He pulled his phone from his pocket, sending a quick message to Angela. "Back up en route. We're pinned down in the warehouse." The faint growl of engines drew closer. James' fingers tightened around his gun. "We can't wait for backup." "We move now, no hesitation." He led the group through the narrow hallway that connected the back of the warehouse to a loading dock. They reached a set of steel doors, only to find them locked. "Damn it," Marcus muttered, scanning the area. "There has to be another way out." Tyrone, still bruised and bloodied, looked at the door, then back at James. "There's a maintenance exit at the other end. It's tight, but it'll lead us out behind the building." "Good. Lead the way." James gestured for Tyrone to go first, keeping a vigilant eye on the shadows. They moved quickly, but the sound of motorcycles grew louder, now accompanied by the unmistakable roar of guns being cocked. The Iron Brotherhood was getting closer, and James knew time was running out. The maintenance exit wasn't much more than a narrow metal door, but it creaked open with surprising ease. They spilled out into the alley behind the warehouse, where the night air was thick with the sound of approaching motorcycles. The alley wasn't much of a hiding place, but it offered a few options. James signaled for them to move quickly, ducking into a nearby storage container. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind them, leaving them in near-complete darkness. They crouched down, holding their breath as the sound of revving engines filled the air. James's mind raced. There had to be a way out of this. Suddenly, headlights flashed in the alley, followed by the unmistakable roar of motorcycles screeching to a halt. The men from the Brotherhood had found their trail. James leaned in close to Marcus. "We can't just sit here and wait. We need to outmaneuver them." Arceus nodded. "I've got an idea, but it's going to be risky." James raised an eyebrow. "We don't have time for caution. What's your plan?" "Follow my lead," Marcus said, his voice steady. He pulled out a small device from his jacket pocket, a smoke grenade. "You think that's going to stop them?" James asked, skeptical. "Not stop them," Marcus said with a grin. "Distract them." James watched as Marcus pulled the pin and tossed the grenade toward the entrance of the alley. The device erupted in a cloud of thick, white smoke, engulfing the area in seconds. "Go, go, go!" Marcus shouted as they scrambled out of the container and sprinted toward the other end of the alley. Through the smoke, the sound of motorcycles revving again mixed with confused shouts from the Brotherhood members. The smoke was doing its job, but it wouldn't last long. James and the team pushed through the alley, their adrenaline pushing them faster than they thought possible. They reached a small gate at the far end, leading into another street. But just as they neared the exit, a figure emerged from the shadows. "Not so fast," the voice growled. James froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The figure stepped forward, and the dim light revealed a familiar face, the man with the tattoo of a skull and wings. "You thought you could just walk away?" he sneered, drawing a gun of his own. The rest of the Brotherhood wasn't far behind, closing in quickly. In that moment, time seemed to stretch. James knew that if they didn't act fast, they'd be cornered, with no way out. His eyes flicked to Marcus, who was already reaching for his gun. Rachel stood at the ready, her stance tense. Then, from behind, the sharp sound of sirens echoed through the night. Angela and her team had arrived. "FBI!" Angela shouted, as she and several agents stormed into the alley, guns drawn. The Brotherhood members hesitated for just a moment, a fatal mistake. James and Marcus didn't waste any time. They fired first, incapacitating the two closest men. The rest of the Brotherhood hesitated again, their hesitation costing them precious seconds. "Move!" James yelled, as the FBI agents moved in, quickly taking control of the situation. The tattooed man lunged at James, but Marcus was faster. He tackled the man to the ground, pinning him with ease. Tyrone stood at James' side, breathing heavily, but his eyes were alight with something that hadn't been there before: hope. "Looks like you've got this under control," Tyrone said, his voice hoarse but grateful. James didn't smile. Not yet. The remaining Brotherhood members were quickly arrested and thrown into the back of FBI vehicles, and within minutes, the alley was swarming with agents, securing the area. Angela approached James, her face tight with resolve. "You were right," she said. "This goes higher than I expected. The Brotherhood's ties to Hayes run deep. You've done good work, Carter." James nodded, but his mind was already racing. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Thanks for the backup," he said, "but we're not done yet. We need to make sure this entire network is exposed, every last part of it." Angela looked at him, understanding in her eyes. "You're not alone in this. We'll take it down together." As the FBI hauled the remaining Brotherhood members away, James' gaze shifted to the horizon. The fight for justice wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time in a long while, James felt like he might just have a chance to win this war. The next steps would be crucial, but he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. And Hayes. He'd soon learn that messing with James Carter was a mistake he'd regret. The end of one chapter had come. But this fight, this story was far from over. As the dust settled, the flashing lights of police vehicles reflected off the cracked walls of the alleyway, signaling the end of a dangerous chapter in James Carter's life. The FBI had T. Aiken control, and the remaining members of the Iron Brotherhood were being carted away, their grip on the city weakening by the minute. Tyrone, though still battered, stood by James' side, a symbol of both the cost of the fight and the hope that it had been worth it. For James, the battle against Hayes and his criminal network was far from over. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had anticipated, and even with the Brotherhood's arrest, he knew the forces behind it all weren't going to go down easily. But for the first time in what felt like forever, James felt a spark of victory. They had exposed the truth, and they were not backing down. Angela and her FBI team had proven invaluable, but James understood that the road ahead would be long and dangerous. He couldn't afford to relax, not yet. The war for justice was only beginning, and if he had learned anything from this experience, it was that the fight would require everything he had, every ounce of strength, and every ally he could trust. But one thing was certain. Hayes' empire was crumbling, and James Carter wasn't going to stop until it had been completely dismantled. This was personal now. They had come too far, fought too hard, to let it slip through their fingers. As the night stretched on and the chaos slowly began to fade, James' thoughts turned to Tyrone, to Luis, and to everyone whose lives had been turned upside down by the ruthless network. He made a promise to them, to the people who had risked everything to help expose the truth. They would see this through to the end. The fight for justice was never easy, but for James Carter, it was the only fight worth winning. And with that, he took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next.